In this lecture, we're going to see how we can transform back and forth between strings and numbers. And this is a common operation in your career as a C++ developer. We're going to see some of the facilities we have to do these kinds of tasks. Okay, we're going to see how we can go from number to string. And this happens if you happen to have a number stored in some variable and you want to treat it like a string. For that, we can use the std2string facility here, and we're going to give it whatever we want to turn into a string in this parenthesis, and what we're going to get out of that is basically going to be a string. We can pass in floats, we can pass in doubles, we can pass in integers. Basically, any number type you have in C++, you can pass it to this thing, and it's going to turn that back into a string. So here we have these things transformed. So down here, we are just trying to print them out to see that the transformation was actually done. And we are going to try this out in Visual Studio Code in a minute. So std2string is what you use to go from number to stdstring. But sometimes we want to do the reverse. We want to go from a string to a number. For example, if somebody typed a number on the console, if our application is taking input from the user, we're going to get that input as a string. So we might want to turn that into a number type, for example, float, double, or int, so that we can work with it in our program as a number type. There are a few facilities we can use from the C++ standard library. And here is a screenshot I took from the documentation from CPP reference for stdstring. If you go to the right here, you're going to see a title that says numeric conversions. And we have a few things we can use to transform back and forth between numbers and strings. We have seen toString, this is what we just saw, but now we are interested in going from a string to a number. And we're going to be using these little guys in here, s2i, s2l, s2ll, s2ul, and we're going to basically see what they do. What we have on the left here is going to be working on integer types. We have integer, we have long int, we have long int, we have unsigned types for integers. So we can use unsigned long and unsigned long. We can do all these kinds of crazy things. If we want to go to a floating type, we have a few we can use here to the right. We have string to float, string to double, string to long double, and we can use these things. So what we're going to do in the next few slides is to look at a few examples of these things and see how they work really. Here you see how you can transform from a string to an integral type like integer, long int, or long int. stdstring number here is a variable that is going to hold our input string. We can put in a representation of a number, but this is going to be a string. Notice that it is between double quotes. So this is going to be a string literal we are using to initialize our stdstring variable here. We can turn this into an integer, for example, by using s2i here. We are going to give it our input value, which is going to be a string representing the number, and we're going to do the transformation here and turn that into an integer. After this operation, we're going to have this integral type stored in int var here, and we can use it however we want. For example, we can print int var, we can see the size of it and really be sure that it is an integer. We can also do the same operations for long type. So this is a variable of long type. We're going to say s2l, we're going to give it the input, and out of this we're going to get a long variable. We can do the same for long, it is basically the same thing, and we can print these things out. And I am just trying to raise your awareness on these facilities you have if you happen to want to transform between strings and numbers. We also have versions that are going to work on unsigned integral types. So we have s2ul, which is going to give us an unsigned long type, and we have s2l, which is going to give us a long type, unsigned type. This should be s2ul, but we're going to correct that when we hit Visual Studio Code. We also have versions that are going to give us floating types, and these are respectively s2f, which is going to give us a float, s2d, which is going to give us a double, and s2ld, which is going to give us a long double. And we are printing these things out to see what we get out of them. Okay, this is really all about these methods. Now we are going to head over to Visual Studio Code and actually play with them. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is transforming from string to numbers. And we are going to put in our template files. Let's do that. I'm going to copy them and put them in place. And we are going to open this up in Visual Studio Code. We're going to open this. And we are going to include our string library. And we are going to put in the code because we want to try and turn numbers into strings. We are going to use std2string here, so we can use that. We have a few number types, float, double, and int, and we want to turn these guys into strings. If you go down here, we set up a few strings, float string, double string, and int string, and we are going to initialize these guys with the return of std2string here. So std2string is what is going to turn a number into a string. In the first line here, what we are doing, we are taking a float variable, we are turning that into a string, and we are using the result of that to initialize our float string variable. And we are basically doing the same thing for double string and int string here. And after we do this, our strings are going to contain string representations of these numbers we have on top here. So down here, we are just trying to print these things to show that it is exactly what we want. We're going to get the size of our float string just to see how it looks. We're going to print the variable and we're going to print the string representation of it. And we do the same thing here for double var and int var. Let's try and build this with GCC. Let's give ourselves some breathing room. And we are going to build with GCC. We're going to use the task to do that. The build is good. We're going to clear. And if we run Rooster, we're going to say size of float string is 9. And let's look at what float string is here. It is down here. And we have 22.29999, many nines. If we count how many characters we have in here, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 characters. And that's what we get in here. This is a string. It's not a number. We also have a float var printed out. This is a float variable. We have double var printed, and we have its string representation. If we print the size, we're going to get a larger size than the 9 we have here. You can try and do that. We have the int var, and we have its string representation, which is also a 223. So this is how you can transform numbers into strings. We are going to comment this out because we want to also see how we can do the reverse transformation and go from string to number. We are going to go down and put in a piece of code that is going to allow us to play with us. What we want is to go from a string to a number. And the facilities we're going to be using are s to I, which is string to integer, s to l, which is string to long, and s to ll, which is string to long. So we have our input string, which is a representation of a number, and we're going to turn that into an integer using s to I. We're going to turn that into a long var using s to l, and we're going to turn that into a long integer using s to ll, and we can print these guys out. You notice that this guy is negative, so this could even be used for negative numbers, and it is really cool. So let's try and build this. We're going to use GCC. And the build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. We're going to see that int var is minus 34. Size of that is 4 because it is an integer. Long var is going to be minus 34. Size of long var is going to be 4. And long, the value inside is minus 34. The size of it is 8. So we have these values in here from a string, and we are using these facilities here. S to I, S to L, and S to LL. You can use these guys to turn whatever string you have into a number. But make sure it really is a string that makes sense to transform into a number. For example, you can't take ABC like this and expect to get something useful out of this. If you try to build this, let's see what we get. The build is going to be successful, but you are most probably going to get some garbage. So let's look at what we have. It's going to crash because you really are trying to do something you shouldn't do. Okay, so don't do that. And you see that this guy was throwing an exception which is going to terminate the program if it is not handled. We haven't really learned about exceptions yet, but so far, just know that you can't pass something that doesn't make sense to be turned into a number. Just put in something that looks like a number. For example, we can put in a positive number here, and if we build, we're going to get something reasonable. Let's clear. And we are going to build. The build is good. And if we run rooster, we are going to get our values in here, and this is really cool. Okay, this is how you can take a string and turn that into an integral type. We are going to see how we can get some unsigned integral types next. Let's comment this out. Notice that we want to get unsigned types. So we need to really take a string that can be turned into an unsigned type. Again, make sure that the input is something that makes sense to be turned into an unsigned type. Okay, if you put in something bad, you're going to get some garbage output, or even worse, your program is going to crash. So here we have our number string. We're going to turn that into unsigned long using this facility here, or we can turn this into unsigned long. So let's do that. S2ULL. That's what we should do here. This was a typo. So if we run this, we're going to get these things run and give us our integral types, and we can use them however we want. Let's build. We're going to build with GCC, and let's clear this out. The build is good, and we're going to run rooster. We're going to have our values in here. So unsigned long var is 34. Size of it is 4. You see that? It is exactly what we want. Unsigned long var is 34, and the size of it is 8. And this is exactly what we expect. So if you want to take a string and turn that into an unsigned integral type, these guys are going to be your friends. But before we go from this, let's see what could happen if you try to put in a negative number. If you try to do that, we are trying to get an unsigned long integer, but we really are putting in a string representation of a negative number. So you can expect this to blow up. Okay, so let's try and build this. We're going to build with GCC. Let's see if the build even goes through. The build is going to go through. And we are going to get something bad happen if we try to print these guys. Look at what we have in here. Oh, unsigned long var, it's really something we didn't put in. This is definitely not minus 34.567. And the reason is the compiler is going to just underflow because this is a negative number. We are trying to store that into an unsigned integer. We're going to get an underflow, and this is going to flip to a really large number for that floating type. So that's what we are getting here. But be sure you really put in what you think is going to give you a valid number. If you try to put in something crazy, you're going to get garbage output like this here. Or even worse, you're going to get a crash. So don't do that. We are going to comment this out and see how we can turn our strings into floating types. Let's go down and do that. Okay, what we want is to turn a string into a floating type. That's what we say here. And the facilities we're going to use are S2F, S2D, and S2LD, which are respectively going to give us a float, a double, and a long double type. We have our input string here, and we're going to pass this into these little facilities we have. And we're going to be getting our number types in here. Float var is going to be a representation of this guy in floating type. Double var is going to be a double version of this. And long double var is going to be a long double version of this. Let's try and build this and see that it goes through. We are going to use GCC as always. The build is good. We're going to clear and run rooster. And we have our numbers here. One is a float, the other is a double, and the other is long double. And this is what we expect. This is really all we set out to do in this lecture, showing you how you can go back and forth between string and numbers. And these are the facilities you can use for these purposes. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to learn about row string literals. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.